what's going on, guys? It's me, Trainman, and welcome back to the Zombie Train, episode 194. I didn't have to look for that one. Anyways, let me get my one... I was about to tout how I didn't need any sort of visual aids for this episode, but in fact, I do. Zombie Train 182. I think this was 182. Yeah. So, I was asked by our very own Mr. Rail Runner, Jake Rail. Where is it? It's down here. Oh, how did you guys signal the lines? I would assume everything had to be manual, but with everything converted to PTC and CTC workings, I assume some rebuild was in order. Well, it's worth pointing out that, so basically this episode's about signals. In the background, we have me fixing assets in Tane. Big surprise there. So, by the way, we actually do get fairly far today. I'm confident with opening the route and poking around in it and just seeing what's broken. I haven't had to actually go in and fix any assets, like, go in and modify them. It's mainly just figuring out what needs to be reverted and what needs to be re-downloaded and stuff like that. It's still a pain in the butt process, but it's not as bad as it could be. Anyways, so on the topic of signals, I actually had... So in the beginning, of course, in the days and months after the Great Panic, we were pretty much the only train on the rails. We didn't really need to care for signals. Most places didn't have power, as I've talked about before, and thus the signals did not work. There are very few mechanical signals left in existence. So, being able to, or rather, not having any sort of signaling for us, we just sort of drove where we wanted to. We did try to keep it careful around areas that we would encounter switches thrown against us, other trains stopped on the line, stuff like that, because we would get those every once in a while. We've had to deal with stopped trains and, just strings of cars laid out, blah blah blah. That happens. A couple of times, and around areas where we would go by and not stop, typically, people would manage to get enough power to turn a signal on, and if we saw a red signal, we generally would stop, because it means that somebody's trying to get our attention, or that the signal is red for some reason. Again, normally, when you don't have power, you don't expect to see a signal of any color, so seeing a red signal was particularly alarming, I guess. Even when we got out west, there wasn't really any signaling. Even when we were going into San Francisco, they weren't really using the rail system for anything. They were using the BART, the light rail, for stuff, for just moving people and resources, but not the heavy intercity stuff primarily. But anyways, once the Zombie Train Incorporated started, obviously we would have a lot of radio operators in towers, and these were people that, well, generally the towers themselves, they would be solar and battery, because they'd be in isolated locations. They'd be in areas where there was generally not much other human presence, and there may be some sort of zombie presence, and that would slowly change from tower to tower as time went on. But the towers themselves had to be fairly well fortified, they had to be fairly well stocked, and they had to be completely independent of the grid. So they would have a radio, a fairly high-powered receiver and transmitter. They would generally be solar-paneled and have batteries for backup and for nighttime and stuff like that. And, of course, they would have rain over the yard. And now, the problem, of course, became a lot of stuff is switch motors. When we came through in the Zombie Train, we had a habit of disconnecting the switch motors and throwing the switches manually, typically with a crowbar, because most of the time we only needed to ever throw the switch one way and go that way and not worry about throwing it the other way, and certainly not care about somebody trying to throw it from a derelict switch tower in a place with no power. So the switches in a lot of places became manual throws with a crowbar for these tower operators, and we basically just kept train position based on radio. And it was, okay, here I am, I'm coming into this yard. We operated very much like railroads did with telegraphs in the 1800s. you let the towers know when you've arrived at some place. If you've had to stop somewhere, we brought torpedoes back into style, placed them on the rail if you're in a high traffic line and you have to stop for some reason. And that's if you have no power, your radio's down, blah, blah, blah. Typically, every engine had a radio. We would generally not send a train out if they didn't have a way to contact their surrounding towers and things like that. Moving on down the line, when we got power up to places, we were able to reconnect or rebuild, because in some cases they were fairly damaged, some of these switch motors and some of these signaling systems. However, in a lot of places, it's pertinent to standardize, and of course I took this to heart. And you guys know me. Naturally, at the time, it wasn't necessarily brought on by my love of the Pennsylvania Railroad, but more a matter of practicality. And obviously what you guys, if you haven't figured it out yet, the things I'm referring to are position light signals. And the reasoning behind using position lights is basically, well, not only the same reasons that the Pennsy did it way back when, but reasons that, stemmed from our position. We didn't have cab signals typically. We still just used radio for that. But, as in checking in and keeping an eye on what's ahead. But wherever we could, we were building and, we were putting up these position lights. The reason they were so important, the reason they were so good is, multifold. It is the fact that they have a lot of standard components, and we did not have the production capability to make a lot of varied parts. We basically just wanted to build, okay, here's the blueprint for a lens and a light, and that is what we're going to stick with, and that is what we're going to use for every single signal that we get our hands on. And this worked out fairly well. You can build the backboards out of just plate metal or even wood sometimes, depending on the situation, but you bring in 8 of these lights or 9 of these lights per signal, and you're all set. And you can do a yard that way, and like I said, if a signal breaks down, not only do you have the parts to replace it, but you probably have plenty of extras on hand. Additionally, while it does take some learning, if you're doing very simple stuff with them, as in horizontal, vertical and diagonal, horizontal being stop, vertical being go, diagonal being caution, then everything is, it's learnable. It's not that bad. And the other thing is, they don't have any sort of complex parts. Now, I already talked about the fact that all of the parts are essentially the same, but even better is the fact that in a switch tower, you can control these all with basically a handful of relays. There are no moving parts, there are no moving lenses, there are no different colors. Like I said, that's the simplicity factor. But it's all just very, very simple. It's not even electronic. It's just electromechanical switches. And that can be easily done and easily worked with. And, they're not mechanical, so we wouldn't have to worry about them freezing up in the cold or getting snow on them or, seizing because of the heat, depending on the location. Keep in mind, we had a nationwide endeavor in terms of replacing these things. It was going to be a nightmare when we looked at all the different signaling systems around the country. Naturally, it was a problem to go through all the places we used and clear out all the old signals and put in all the new signals, and a lot of places had basically what we called legacy signals, basically for as long as we could support them before we knew we had to come in and replace them, supplant them with our standard signaling. But it all went very quickly. It was, we have this line, it's going to be trafficked, it needs signaling. When you have more trains on a line than one man in a dispatch tower can keep tabs on and communicate with just simply on his own, then you need the signals. And it was very important to us to be able to fix those no matter what, to be able to, get our hands on them. Now, we could have pulled up a lot of stuff from other places and sort of, sacrifice a lot of things to get a few working things. But again, it was the opportunity to make sure that no matter where you are in the system, you know exactly what's going on when you look at the signal. And frankly, it helped things immensely. I won't really get into that now, but in the early days of the Zombie Train Incorporated, there were plenty of mishaps involving, either signaling that you'd expect to work and didn't work, or signaling that, was ignored because it was expected that the signaling was inoperable or irrelevant. You have dispatchers who are simply overwhelmed. And frankly, I was always impressed by the tenacity of these dispatchers that we'd send out there, because again, they'd be in a lot of times in cities, in places where there was quite a high population of Zax, of undead, and they were on their own, and they would have to fortify, and they would have to hold off those zombies, and a few times we had to pull dispatchers out because they got overrun, and then reroute all the trains. And that would cost us in materials and in time, and, among other things, among just people being a little bit freaked out, desensitization is a thing, but it's not complete. And, the other thing is we had a primary distribution point for these, and we were producing these signals. Where was it? It was not far from Quonset, because that was sort of where we got off the ground. And it was a couple of these mills, because, okay, so just to preface here, there was a group called the Pawtuckets. I think they were the Pawtuckets, or they were the Pawtucks. That's what they were. And they had a lot of the area in and around Pawtucket, and they were holding themselves off from the zombies that were infesting Providence, and then eventually they got overrun. They actually had a couple of spats with us, a couple of spats with the Islanders and the Quonsets, and they were not particularly agreeable people, but they existed. We weren't going to do anything about it, and then they were wiped off the face of the earth. And this is one of the few opportunities we had to make use of other infrastructure. I'm not going to say the few opportunities, but it was one particularly good one, considering the fact that we were basically given this swath of land that had been outfitted for not quite self-sufficiency, but survival. And in it contained a handful of these water-powered mills. And while they weren't admittedly too close to railroad tracks, they did allow us to... Well, originally we were using them as a stamping plant and as a manufacturing place, because they were in a fairly strategic location, butted up against the river. And then we moved on to using them for power, and we actually installed generators from the New England Wireless and Steam Museum. We jacked them out of there, brought them up to Pawtucket, and started generating power in Pawtucket. And we used that to power some other mills that were off to the side of the Providence and Worcester line, something directly there. And that's what we used for a lot of the assembly and a lot of the manufacturing. The steel itself came from elsewhere. I can't remember exactly where it was. It may have been somewhere further. It may have been somewhere out west, but I don't think it was that far away. It may have been, some of the revitalized places around in Pennsylvania or in Ohio. See, I can't remember now because it was just one of those particular. Oh, we've got a steel furnace here, or at least an iron furnace here. We can cast things, and so we're going to cast these, and of course the glass as well. Oh, it was a supply line. It was. I don't want to call it excessive, but it was very much a lot of effort to get those signals out there. And however, I do affirm that it was less effort than it would have taken to refurbish all of these different signaling systems that are present all around the country, and dealing with the variety, and dealing with all of these different kinds of parts. It's not, when you have the ability to not cannibalize, it's 100% worth it to not cannibalize, just to make your own. And we kept those for a very, very long time, and even up into the diesels, we had, once we got the diesels running, we had GPS positioning and stuff like that. It became a lot easier, but the PLs never went away. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys next week. Trainman out.